Before today's episode, I want to share some exciting news. First of all, I'm very happy to announce that there will now be new episodes twice a month. So every other Tuesday, there will be a new excursion into the forest of thought. Secondly, I've launched a Substack, which I'll be using to stay in touch and to dispatch episodes and the occasional essay. So head over to forestofthought.substack.com and join the mailing list, either as a free or paying subscriber. This podcast is made possible by people like you. So if you're enjoying these thought adventures, please consider supporting the podcast via Substack, as mentioned, or also via Patreon. You'll find more information and direct links in the episode description or by visiting forestofthought.com. All right, enough chit-chat. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome to the Forest of Thoughts with me, Ingrid Rieser. What are the underlying patterns of thought that have led our civilization into its current crises? And how might we begin to tell a different story? One that would allow both humans and the more than human to thrive. In this episode, I speak to author Jeremy LENT.
It's all about integration. Modern findings in system science, complexity theory, and other approaches actually point to the same deep understanding that those sources of traditional wisdom pointed to. What they point to is this recognition of our deep interconnectedness.
In his book, The Patterning Instinct, Jeremy identifies the root metaphors that different cultures have used to construct meaning in their universe, also tracing the deep historical foundations of our modern worldview. In his latest book, The Web of Meaning, he integrates science with traditional wisdom to tell a new story, one that is both scientifically rigorous and intrinsically meaningful. We talked on the well-trimmed lawns of Pomona College on the outskirts of Los Angeles. On our way there, we saw an owl perched high in a tree in the bright sunshine, looking out towards the place we were about to sit. We chose to interpret this as a good sign for the conversation to come. Thank you so much for taking time to have this conversation.
Yeah, I'm so glad. Looking forward to it, Ingrid. Thank you.
Yeah. I wanted to actually start with asking you about your journey a little bit, because
Sure.
You've been the CEO of an internet company in
Right.
Silicon Valley. You worked as an executive at a credit card company. Is
Yes.
that right? Yes. And
Yeah,
so
I know.
I wanted to ask you a little bit
Kind of
about
strange.
your journey from doing that to doing the things that you're doing now.
Yeah, absolutely, Ingrid.
Yeah.
I really spent the first half of my life actually in this whole mindset of what we are sort of right now, a lot of us trying to break out of, whatever. And as part of that, I got an MBA at the University of Chicago and started an internet company during the first .com boom. But then what happened to me was everything kind of crashed around me in my life. My wife at the time, she passed away some years back, but she was really the only relationship I'd had in that first part of my life. She got very sick, and I left the company to look after her. And then the company collapsed. It was like this brand new internet company. It was too soon to really to sort of step aside from it. And I spent years looking after her, but she had gone into sort of like a borderline dementia kind of place where I really lost the person that I really loved. And so it felt like everything I built had crashed. And what I was determined to do was to really sort of set myself a commitment that whatever I did with the rest of my life would be truly meaningful. And I didn't want to take somebody else's word for what was meaningful. I wanted to figure it out for myself. And that I wasn't planning it at the time, but it led me into years and years of really trying to sense what is meaning and what are these things that we take for granted, these concepts, whether it's God or humanity or like any sort of big concept, where do those actually ideas come from? And that's what led me to sort of, felt like I was peeling the onion, if you will, of that every time I'd look at history and then want to go further back and then look at anthropology and then want to go further back into biology and evolutionary biology and cognitive science. And that led me over a long period of time to begin to really rethink really everything about my own life and understand things in a very different way. And the books, well, particularly that first book I wrote, The Patterning Instinct, in a way was like the book that I was looking for when I first started this inquiry. Like, how does all these things come together? So it felt like something that I wanted to do for others, and also just really felt driven to do, was to try to express my own sort of ways in which I had put all those pieces together in a way that had made sense to me, at least.
Yeah. Well, if we start with that book, The Patterning Instinct, and it's a cultural history of humanity's search for meaning.
Right.
Yeah. And you look at how humans are meaning-making creatures, and how we have had these different worldviews and core metaphors throughout our history. And I really enjoyed that so much because, well, what I appreciate about that so much is that it shows that we have really thought differently and been differently in the world previously, and we will be differently in the future. We can be, and it's inevitable that we will be.
Yes.
And so, but what were the main things that you really took with you from that book?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, one of the most interesting things that I came to understand from that book and from all the research went into it is really what ended up being the title of the book, that we have as humans, like what actually makes us not unique compared to other mammals, but uniquely developed in this particular area of a highly, highly developed instinct to pattern meaning into things. And from a neuroscience point of view, that can be seen directly in our highly evolved prefrontal cortex, which as a percent of our overall body size is higher in human beings. And then we actually have a whole front of it that is way the other mammals barely even have, which is a sort of part of it that connects all things together. And so that prefrontal cortex, really, people talk about it as like the executive function of the human brain, because it's like it takes all the inputs from our feelings, our thoughts, our senses, everything, and it connects them all together. And it sort of helps us to figure out what we're doing next, and what and how to make sense of things. And it also helped us to conceptualize and developed things like highly evolved language and other aspects that are so much part of what we became as human beings. So when we think about what makes humans unique, because of that prefrontal cortex, and because we develop culturally as children over decades, the first sort of 20, 25 plus years of our lives, we're developing, you can't really say that there's much that is unique about humans because each culture is so different, other than we do have this shared need to make meaning of things. And when in the earliest days, when we made meaning out of things, as we began to really sort of become Homo sapiens, basically, we'd look at the skies and at the sky and the stars, and we'd pattern constellations into it. And now, as cultures have developed, we sort of uniquely learn to make sense of things based on our own culture. And so the sweep of the book then goes from that to realizing that the ways in which different cultures made sense of the universe actually has affected the shape of history. And that's what's so fascinating to understand. One thing is to just realize that there are fundamentally different ways we can make meaning out of life. And then also to see how, when we look what's going on in the world right now, ultimately it is driven by the meaning making that our culture imposes on us.
Right, you had this, you summarized it sort of as this worldviews shape values and values shape history.
Exactly.
Different worldviews can create other values that can change history.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so in that book, you're kind of giving this historical overview, and then your next book, The Web of Meaning, in a way you're sort of even providing then sketching out another worldview. What kind of worldview would we need in order to enable human flourishing on a thriving planet?
Yeah, that is exactly right. In fact, as I mentioned just a little bit before, when I first took all these notes, it's thousands of pages, a Word document of all these notes, I thought I was going to crystallize it into one book. It was only when I started trying to put this all together and I began to realize, wow, this is 2 books. I mean, there's no way that this could ever be in one. But it really is very much like a sort of A and B, like a sequel. So that first one, like you say, is almost, we can think of it as a diagnosis of like, this is where we've come from. And then the second one really sets, to your point, it sets the foundations for a different kind of worldview. And in a way, what it does, it's all about integration. It looks at, it really shows a worldview that actually takes the great insights from traditional wisdom, from indigenous cultures, from Buddhism, Taoism, or Confucianism in the East. And it actually looks at how modern findings in system science, complexity theory, and other approaches actually points to the same deep understanding that those sources of traditional wisdom pointed to. That essentially what they point to is this recognition of our deep interconnectedness. And so what that book really is about, if anything, is starting from that understanding. It looks at the biggest questions that we humans can never ask ourselves in our lives, like things like, who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? Or even, why am I? And in each case, what it shows is how the modern dominant worldview's way of answering those questions is not only dangerous and leading us on this path of total destruction of our Earth and maybe even our own civilization, but it's actually wrong on the basis of actually rigorous science. That in science we find out there's been decades now of systems sciences developed that show that there's other ways of understanding things from a scientific basis that lead to very different ways to answering some of those fundamental questions. A lot of the things that we think are scientific facts that we take for granted actually got developed around the 17th or 18th centuries and have been totally superseded, and yet so many people just take for granted what they understand from those times.
Yeah, well, you start the book in a great way. You start it with this tea with Uncle Bob,
right.
And so you describe a scene in which you're having, a family occasion with and chit-chatting and so on about the state of the world, and then someone, Uncle Bob in this case, says, well, yeah, it would be great if things could be different, if we could have a better system than capitalism, if we find a different way of organizing life on the planet.
Right.
But we know that that's not possible because we're selfish creatures in a dog-eat-dog world,
right.
And there's not really any alternative to that. What else does Uncle Bob say? He has, well, if you want, he kind of summarizes
right,
this.
You're summarizing it beautifully,
Yeah.
and then he sort of goes on basically to say, and that's the great thing about capitalism, because it takes that selfishness, and you've heard about Adam Smith and the invisible hand, and it just, if everyone just does their own selfish thing for themselves, it ends up being the best thing for everybody. And so, and yeah, we got problems like maybe like this climate impact or whatever, but technology will solve it. Just let the market come up with its solutions. And then he turns to, and you think there's alternatives, look at communism. Look what happened with that. So there's nothing really left to say. And so sort of it basically kills the conversation. And then everyone goes like, oh, how did little Betty do in her dancing lessons? Because there's nothing left to say. And in a way, the book is presented as this is like a long, extensive answer to Uncle Bob, basically. That every one of those things that we just take for granted, and we hear on the media, on news, or just articles that don't even question those things. They just take that as a solid basis. They're false assumptions. And it's only by questioning those assumptions that we begin to actually see there are very different ways of actually making sense of all of those things.
Yeah, and there's so much to talk about. So, well, we can sort of see which of those things we want to zoom in on. I mean, one of the things that you talk about is this idea of human nature as being that we're mostly these selfish creatures, but also that, in a way, the Richard Dawkins view that we're actually, in a way, just these receptacle for the
selfish gene, or
the survival of the selfish gene, that life is kind of like a machine that runs according to an algorithm,
right?
And that's pretty much all there is to it.
Yes.
And so one of the things that you do is kind of explore, the inherent sort of fallacies in that, which we also is one of those things that we take for granted. I don't know if you want to say something about
absolutely.
that.
Well, this is a crucial point that you're bringing up. And what's interesting about all this, I mean, basically what you're describing, what Richard Dawkins does, and does it very powerfully, is put forward a case that's really we can call reductionism. And actually, reductionism started all the way back with Descartes, again, back in the 17th century. And reductionism was a very powerful methodology. And Descartes was the one who initially called it that. And he said, like, what we need to do is, they were looking at the beginnings of science, and they were realizing if you break things down into the smallest parts, you can explain them better. And this was before they'd even come up with the ideas of different fields like physics and chemistry or biology. But what happened was, over generations, they began to realize, okay, we break it down into these fields, and then in each one of those, in chemistry we discover elements, in biology we discover genes or cells, and then in physics, we discover, of course, like the nucleus and the atom. And when people realize that, it's that reductionist methodology that's been so powerful over hundreds of years. So you have to grant Descartes, it was a brilliant move.
Yeah.
It led to the development of all the science we have, the abilities for us to have the internet and the germ theory of disease, and great benefits it has brought. But what happens is, people get so sort of taken up by the power of reductionism that a lot of the time they begin to think that it explains everything in the world. And there's nothing that reductionism can't explain. And that the entire universe ultimately can be broken down and explained in this reductionist way. And that's the mistake that I believe that people make. It's like, we can consider it like an ontological leap. And really that leap is just as big a leap as somebody else who says, oh, this must have been created by a god, so let me just worship the God who created it. It's an assumption on which there is no actual scientific basis to make. And in fact, this is why reductionists often are so taken up by what they do that they totally ignore these other disciplines that have arisen now over the last 100 years around systems thinking, which really looks at everything not in a way that says no to reductionism, but says yes, as well as reductionism, there is also another way of making sense of things. And in simple terms, what systems thinking talks about is, if reductionism looks at the things the elements that everything is made of, systems thinking looks at the ways in which all those parts connect up. And what systems thinking says, and when I say systems thinking, that includes things like complexity theory, it can include things like evolutionary biology, it can include things like earth science, chaos theory. There's a lot of different elements to systems thinking, as well as, of course, systems biology. But what it says is actually looking at the relationship between things can tell us as much and sometimes more about them than just the things themselves. And that's it's really one of the great losses in our world today, is that so much reductionist science still has failed to embrace and absorb the fact that there's another layer of understanding that's available. And that systems thinking works so well when we are looking at complex systems, of which basically any living entity, or our entire global society, which is like entities of entities, if you will, are all complex systems, which can be understood better in that way by applying a systems lens.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that, like you said, science does not really support Uncle Bob's view, and neither do these ancient traditions and the sort of indigenous wisdoms that you were mentioned briefly earlier, because they're the story of interconnectedness and the story about the relationship between things is of equal importance to the things themselves.
Exactly.
Is very strong there.
Exactly, and that interface with ancient traditions, I think, is a key to this availability of meaning making. A lot of what this book, The Web of Meaning, was about. And maybe one way of understanding this is, you remember before I was talking about how when I started this journey, I sort of made this commitment to myself. I really wanted to understand meaning myself and not take somebody else's word for it. And a part of my commitment to myself was that I wanted it, whatever I understood, I wanted it to be really coherent intellectually for myself. That was just a promise to myself. So there was a risk. I felt like I'll read all these great traditions from the past, and I might feel, well, they're really lovely and I can learn a lot, but they're not really scientific or whatever. And as I was doing these years of research, and I was discovering about, for example, in traditional Chinese thought, this concept that arose in a group of thinkers that integrated Buddhist and Confucian and Taoist thought. They were called Neo-Confucian thinkers from about 1,000 years ago. And they had this idea of the entire universe consists of Qi, which is like energy and matter, and Li, which is the organizing principles, the way in which that Qi connects to form different things that we are, human beings or earth or mountains or whatever. And right at the same time, I was reading one of the best complexity scientists, a thinker called Stuart Kauffman, who wrote these great books about looking at the bigger, broader meaning of complexity theory that he was well versed in. And he was talking about how we're entering a new field, if you will, that has never been explored before, and there are new principles we have to discern. And a sort of light bulb went off in my mind. I was going, wait, these Neo-Confucians were looking at the same understanding of the universe 1,000 years ago. And there are these great wisdom traditions that might not have some of the scientific or mathematical language of now, but they were looking at the same thing. And they developed a great deal of wisdom that we can turn to that is actually not separate from science, but is scientifically coherent and every bit as valid as what some scientist puts on the table, but can allow us to understand this new way of meaning making all through our Buddhas and through our generations and through our connection with the earth. So that was a huge realization that, in fact, the gap, we're told there's this sort of separation between science and qualitative, spiritual, traditional wisdom or whatever. And a big part of what this book, The Web of Meaning, says is actually that separation is itself a made-up construction of modernism.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because one can really see the influence of these old Chinese traditions, as you said. Well, maybe we can zoom in on that a little bit, because I find you bring in these concepts from that they had developed, which are so helpful. And so, yeah, do you want to say a little bit more about that, about this? I mean, just the word Tao is interesting in that way, because it is provides us with something that doesn't really have, I mean, it's translated as the way, but it contains much more than that, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. And for me, really discovering Taoism was another really great entry point in my life into really understanding a different sense of meaning making. And I think one of the major gifts that Taoism offers to us and has offered to us over the millennia is this concept of really understanding everything in terms of this notion of the Tao, which is really the sort of way in which the universe unfolds. And from that, they developed this core concept of what they call Wu Wei, which is the sense of if you begin to understand the universe as this continual unfolding, then the path of great wisdom is to learn how to flow with it, not how to fight that unfolding of the universe, but how do you optimally flow with it. So they have these great stories of people who sort of come to this place. It's like, if you will, almost a place of enlightenment, where everything that happens, they can like go with the flow of it and not waste all this energy sort of trying to fight it. And what's interesting about that is the opposite of Wu Wei, of going with that flow. They call Yu Wei, which, so if Wu Wei translates basically as no action or effortless action, and Yu Wei, the opposite, translates as putting an effort into things and doing stuff against the flow of nature. But in a way, that's exactly what civilization has done. They talk about, the Taoists talk about the idea of Yu Wei would be to take a pump and to pump water uphill when in fact it wants to just flow downhill. So you're going against the flow. Well, of course, that's the whole, so almost like the iconic thing of what technology is about. And this kind of helps to take us to another level, actually, because while I love Taoism and that notion of the Wu Wei, what is really interesting is to recognize that as human beings, we have both Wu Wei and Yu Wei. Like I talked earlier about that part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that actually is the biological foundation of us having things like this sense of a separate self and seeing ourselves as separate from things around us and formulating objectives and goals and arranging our life around those goals and overcoming some of our drives in order to achieve things. And that's part of what we are as human beings.
Which can be a good thing.
Which can be a good thing, exactly. Right. We don't have to view that as, oh my God, we're really bad, like all of life is so one and we're separated. But what's available to us is to develop what I call an integrated consciousness. We can think of Wu Wei as being more like what I call in the book like our animate consciousness, that part of our consciousness that connects us with all of life. Now that's a part of consciousness that Western thought, and Descartes was absolutely one of the foundational thinkers around that, they defined human beings as separate from the rest of life, fundamentally, not even as being part of life, but there's life over there and then there's human beings over here. And the essence of the human being was that famous quote from Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. That sort of captured it. It's that thinking essence is what we can call our conceptual consciousness, which is the kind of consciousness that arises from our prefrontal cortex. Now, Western thinkers were so caught up in that, they saw that as the sheer identity of human beings. The Taoists, on the other hand, were so much into the flow, they felt the whole essence of everything is to get back into that flow. But we can actually integrate those two together. And this is one thing I loved about the Neo-Confucians, because they did a lot of that integration themselves. And they can say, actually, the essence of what we are as human beings is to integrate those two levels of consciousness so that we can actually use our conceptual thinking ability to really connect with what we're feeling, to understand more deeply what we're feeling and act accordingly. And we can also use our feelings to make our thinking brain wiser and to actually get to a place of wisdom just from simple knowledge. So it's that integrated consciousness that, in my view, is available to each of us as human beings, that embrace all the different parts of what we are as human.
Yeah, and you mentioned Li earlier as another one of these useful concepts. Now that we have a bit more background, would you like to say a little bit more about that?
Yes, and so Lee, what I found so fascinating about that is it was right around when I was reading this work from Stuart Kauffman talking about how we need to formulate ways of meaning, of understanding our universe based on recognizing that it's the principles by which things connect that are so important. And the very translation of the word Li in some translations of it are pretty much exactly that, the connecting principle of the qi. And that was the realization that once we look at the ways in which things connect, it leads to whole different ways of making sense of basically every aspect of the universe. I mean, for starters, we get to see patterns of the universe, like fractals, for example, are really patterns of connection, which show themselves at different levels of scale, from small all the way to huge, which is a mathematical concept, but almost ties precisely into this very understanding of Li. But it also leads us to this deeper recognition that once you start to look at everything from the place of interconnectedness, then you realize some of the separations that we make coming from that prefrontal cortex mediated thinking are actually made up false separations. So the very idea of a separate self with a boundary, and here's me inside that boundary, and here's the rest of the world outside that boundary, when you really look at the places of interconnectedness, you recognize that is a construction that our own mind is making. That there are no like hard and fast boundaries like that. That actually what each of us is this just a temporary eddy of this flow of biological evolution, a temporary eddy of this flow of atoms and molecules and cells that come together in a particular kind of place. That's our very consciousness is that.
Yeah, well, it's this crazy thing that we have in this continuous flow of everything that we take out and everything that we expel, that there is this pattern that we could identify as Ingrid or as Jeremy.
Yes, exactly.
And so it's like you say in the book, even if all of our cells are exchanged, or this famous example of the ship of Theseus, where they're sort of changing out every material bit of the ship. Is the ship still the same ship?
Exactly.
But yeah, that there is this recognizable thing that is you or me, despite the ever changing nature of the flows of energy. And so that in a way is this pattern or a part of it.
That's right. No, that is that is exactly right. So our very bodies, there's really not a single cell in your body or mine that was in us, or probably not even a single molecule, literally, that was in us as little children, but we still have memories of that time. So where does that exist?
Yeah.
In the Li, basically, in those patterns of connection, which actually remain more resilient than the stuff of which they're made. So that's a key insight. You know, to me, one of the most important things around that is, at least in my particular path, and I write about this, where this can lead to in the web of meaning, that we begin to realize that we're not only are we not separate from life, but we are life. That actually we can recognize here's life that evolved over billions of years on this earth. And each of us, you and I, and all the blades of grass and trees, everything around us, are basically manifestations of that same unfolding. And once we begin to see ourselves in that way, the very idea of a separate identity begins to get a little bit more blurred, which in some ways can be incredibly liberating, because and then we can even see our own death, rather than it being, oh, it's the end, and then we have to maybe make up or take somebody else's belief, oh, well, our soul will go to heaven and we'll be there eternally or whatever, and that will make us feel better because we don't want to feel that it could all actually be over. But we can actually recognize that as being part of life, the patterns that we are within ourselves, the Li that makes me, and makes you, and Ingrid, those are patterns that are actually getting transmitted all the time, like ripples that go out into the field. So just the very conversation we're having right now, I'm taking in some patterns of Ingrid, and you're taking in some patterns of me, and we're continually connecting those patterns with others. So if we begin to say our identity itself as our Li, we become immortal, basically. We basically are one with all of life around us, all the different ways in which we've connected. Which also brings in a little bit like a moral question about that. It's a little bit of a sense of responsibility, if you will, too, because
that's a huge responsibility.
I don't want to be transmitting patterns of anger or hate or aggression that then also can get transmitted through the generations into others. But how can we transmit patterns that are really life-affirming?
Yeah, I think you write that in the book, that everything we do and everything we say has this kind of Li pattern attached to it, and it creates these ripples. We don't know the effect of them. I mean, I experienced that a lot with the podcast. I'll record an episode and send it out into the world, and usually I don't hear so much about, so much feedback, and then much later I'll find out that it had a huge impact on someone or something. But a lot of the time we actually don't know. So what do you think about that? We don't know. Sometimes it's easy to know what is an action or a way of speaking that is aligned with the Tao, let's say.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's hard to know. And so, and we don't get immediate feedback on that. And so how do we know whether we are contributing to this flow of life or
this
not?
Is a great question, Ingrid. And what that leads me in my mind to another Neo-Confucian concept, actually, which I think comes to the heart of it, is the word in Chinese, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong, but it's like Cheng, and it's spelt in English Cheng, but I understand it's pronounced Cheng, and basically it means like integrity is the best, or authenticity is the best way to explain what that word means. And we can think of that sort of Cheng, if we think of an ecosystem that's really healthy and all the different parts do what they do naturally, and it just maintains itself really strong and resilient over time. Or a tree might have Cheng in terms of just its own essence. It knows what it's doing with its roots and its leaves, and it's acting in its own authenticity. And as humans, because of our split consciousness we've talked about, that's where a lot of it gets confusing. And my brain goes off in one direction, but like something doesn't quite feel right. So what the practice of living according to that Cheng is really to become much more embodied and really learn how to feel into those sort of very quiet, almost hidden elements within our felt consciousness that wants to be heard, but oftentimes is like subterranean, below the levels of our sort of conscious awareness. And that's where, to me personally, practices ranging from meditation to traditional Chinese practices of Qigong, or in particular, that's been very meaningful for me, can be very helpful to develop that sense of a truly integrated, embodied consciousness. And it's with that consciousness that we can begin to answer that question. One of those great Neo-Confucian philosophers called Wang Yang said something like, paraphrasing it, but something like, there is no greater experience for a human being to have than to look inside yourself and to see and to feel that Cheng. And I think that's what we can all work on. Like, how can we be truly authentic within ourselves? Because when we're really being true to ourselves, that's when we can trust that our actions will have those patterns of impact will be the most life-affirming, the most positive. And sometimes in the short term, it might seem the opposite is true in terms of what we're doing. But if we have to, that's where really look into ourselves with true honesty and curiosity and say, am I truly acting with Cheng? And, and sometimes it might be the work of many years or even a lifetime to keep asking that question and get a deeper and deeper understanding of what that means.
It makes me think about this Spinoza, this concept that Spinoza had of conatus. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's kind of conatus in a way is each of ours sort of expression of life force, and we can be living according to our conatus or not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, I think that's completely consistent. And I don't know if you know the work of ecological philosopher Freya Matthews. She uses that term conatus a lot about, basically about each individual organism within an ecosystem acts according to that sense, their conatus, their true what they need. And it's when they've learned through evolution to work together in mutual synergy that leads to the flourishing of our life itself through that kind of mutual beneficial search for that conatus.
And the strange thing is that we are of life, we are life, and yet we're so destructive in a way.
Yes.
How is that really possible?
Yeah. Well, thanks. A key question, obviously, and one that I answer, to some degree, in the later part of the patterning instinct by looking at this dominant worldview that has really taken over, really the entire world, which is this worldview of separation that arose with Descartes and Francis Bacon and those others in early modern Europe, and because of colonialism, basically, and this expansion of white Europeans through the rest of the world, it's become the dominant worldview that almost everyone in the world has to live under today and is born into. And that worldview is one that essentially has taken that conceptual consciousness and denied that animate consciousness. So it's a very unintegrated worldview. And it's really when you have layers upon layers, generations upon generations of accumulative knowledge and power based on this maximizing for just that Cartesian, I think, therefore I am way of thinking. It leads to seeing nature basically not as part of what we are, but as a simple resource for consumption. And it looks at basically other people as resources to exploit because they're not me and I'm separate from them. And so it's this refusal to look at those connections. And we've come to this place right now where that worldview is destroying the world at such a rapid rate that it might actually be the cause of its own destruction in this century. And that's really a lot of what this book that I'm writing now is about, is really if we look at that worldview of the web of meaning, that process of deep connectedness, how could that actually lead us to organize ourselves in a way that was not so destructive, the way our dominant world does now?
Do you want to say a little bit about that, about that work that you're going into now?
Yeah, well, sure, I'd be happy to. So, really, that last book we've been talking about, The Web of Meaning, actually ends on the topic of this vision of an ecological civilization, which is really the idea of really asking that question: what would the world look like if we were to design it rather than based on this worldview of separation, on extraction and exploitation, if we were to design it simply to set the conditions for all beings to thrive on a regenerated earth? And so even though in the Web of Meaning I touched on these ideas, that's where the book ended. And since I completed that book some years back, I've kind of gone into some deep research to try to understand that question. And what's been fascinating for me is to discover that in every aspect of what we call civilization, people have already done the work to think about this. They've been looking at life-affirming, fundamentally, radically different alternatives to everything from technology, education, economics, governance, law, rethinking things from a very profound way. And I began to see that if we could weave all of these different ideas together into a coherent whole, we could begin to actually develop a sense of a future that would truly give Uncle Bob, the run for his money, if we go back to him originally, say, actually, there is an alternative. There was this famous quote, really, just like Uncle Bob, from Margaret Thatcher back in the 1970s or 1980s, when she famously said, "There is no alternative. This is what you're stuck with, so you better figure out how to make it work as well as possible." Got shortened to Tina. And in a way, ever since those years, we've now had roughly 50 years of people coming up with ideas as if that was true, as if there's nothing other than neoliberal capitalism for us as a system. But what this new book I'm working on looks at these great insights from so many people and groups around the world who are living into these alternatives, and shows actually there is an alternative. There is a way forward that could actually allow all of us to have a modern technological civilization that actually worked for all of us without the incredible poverty and the violence and the racism and the wars that take place right now. But it needs fundamental systemic changes. And so the real message of the book is we're not going to get there by doing a few good incremental things. We have to look at deeper changes of this global system of capitalism. But the good news is that there is actually an alternative that is available to us if we work together to try to make that happen.
Well, and we look forward to reading that. I want to go back to I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the web of meaning, because you write there that meaning is something that we make, something that we construct in a way, and that like a rainbow, it's not really there until you, as the person seeing the rainbow, enact it. Which I thought was a quite beautiful pattern, beautiful image, because I think otherwise people can feel that if we need to make the meaning, then we're pretending.
Right.
You see what I mean?
Yes, I do. Absolutely.
So what could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think this is a great point. And so maybe the best way of coming at that is to look at what we traditionally think of as meaning, coming from that sort of modernist sort of point of view, that if we do live in this world where there's just objective realities, then either like meaning is there or it isn't. And it's like, where do you see it? And if you don't see it, then the only other alternative is you're completely making it up. And so that gives us this kind of either or. And so somebody might, for example, say have a psychedelic experience and be in touch with this incredible, profound insights. And then somebody might ask, yeah, but is that real? Or is it just because they took a few chemicals that did something to their brain? So it's like, again, we're stuck in this either or. But from this place of deep interconnectedness and just following on from the logic, if you will, of what we've been talking about earlier, like this recognition of the Li and the connections between things being more important than the things themselves, we can begin to see meaning itself in that way. The meaning itself is actually a function of connectedness. So there's this beautiful concept in traditional early Buddhist thought called Indra's web, which is the idea of Indra, who was this god who then created this net, or actually it was called Indra's net, of these incredible reflecting jewels that reflected everything in them, and they went on infinitely and put them all together. And you could look at this net, and in every one of these jewels you saw all of the other jewels connected there. And then if you look closer, you could see the connections of all the other jewels, the reflections within those reflections. So there's almost like this sense of the actual meaning of things is not to be found in some end point, but is in all of these interconnections. So when we get in touch with that sense of deep meaning, it's really what we're allowing us to do is really, in a way, becoming that integrated consciousness that I've been talking about, just allowing that consciousness to actually experience that reality of that deep, deep interconnectedness with all of the universe, past and future and beyond, in every kind of way. So that's the way in which, when I say that we enact meaning, it's the same way in which a number of cognitive philosophers talk about how we enact consciousness. The consciousness itself is not something that just kind of happens, but it's through our extending it, it's through our making these connections and then making the connections within our own brain that we actually are part of this kind of consciousness within ourselves. And similarly with meaning, we see it as an emergent phenomenon that arises from all those things connecting up. So the wonderful thing about that is that it's as if we, rather than having to search for meaning, we can just allow the meaning to then be part of infusing really every aspect of what we do, moment to moment within our lives, which then allows this kind of deep relaxation, if you will. Okay, so I can just be with each moment, be with my actions in a way that ultimately feels truly meaningful as that function of connectedness.
Yeah. I wrote down this wonderful quote that you have in the book. In the same way that we can enact a rainbow by gazing into the rain, we enact meaning by the way in which we attune to the connective rhythms of the universe. Like music being played, like the refracted sunlight in the rain, the meaning potential is always there. It's just waiting for us to tune into the right wavelength and engage with it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, thank you.
That's beautiful. Is there anything else connecting to the things that we've talked about so far that you would like to add?
Yeah, well, I think that maybe one thing that is asking in my own cognitive field to be sort of brought out is there's a certain kind of implication that arises from that I feel it's really important that everyone who's part of this conversation to sort of embrace in themselves, which is really when you begin to understand, to get to that level of meaning as connectedness and the fact that I am life, we all are life as part of this kind of unfolding of life around us. And we're all connected with everything around us. There's something very beautiful that arises out of that. And there's also something that can lead to a sense of a deep moral imperative in terms of what we do with our lives. Because once I realize I am life, and when I really truly feel into that, it's like I am also under attack from this dominant civilization. And I, as life, am being like terribly wounded and suffering these terrible pains. And it's getting worse and worse and worse. So I feel that through and through. And as such, then it becomes, for me, I can speak from my own sense, my own journey, and maybe it can be true for any of us, to feel that as part of life, it becomes really our own way of living life to its fullest is to look at what are the ways in which we can take each of our unique expressions, our unique special capabilities, and really use that in this embodied existence for the true benefit of all life. And around that means engaging with everything that is going on and recognizing many of us who might be listening to this podcast can be in a place of privilege, of economic and cultural and educational privilege, and are able to make choices about what we do with that, and recognizing that privilege itself has come from the oppression of hundreds of years of exploitation of other people and the devastation of this living earth. And the realization that doesn't have to make us then feel guilty and terrible about ourselves. But once we realize that, it can allow us to actually say, how can I take my own talents and actually turn that, how can I use that privilege for the benefit of all? So I feel that's what is the true implication, or at least one of the most important implications that comes from this deep understanding, is that turn towards life itself and asking what it is that we can do for that benefit of all of us that are living.
Yeah, the question that you end the book with is this: what sacred and precious strand will I weave, or will you weave? Yeah. Exactly. Well, there's so much more we could talk about, but we maybe have to say that for the next conversation. Next time, maybe we can talk about the next book. which you're finishing.
That sounds great, and that's coming out in May 2026. So yeah, let's plan to have a follow-up then, as that book comes out. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Ingrid.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking time, and thank you for this lovely spot in the shade of the trees.
So lovely, huh?
Yeah.
It is a great idea to come out here.
Yeah, and this thing that we talked about, how the conversations that we have are also changing us.
Yes.
Then that's one of the reasons I enjoy doing the interviews outside, because it makes it easier to see how the places that we inhabit also are a part of that conversation.
It's really true, Ingrid.
Yeah.
It's true, because I'm so used to doing these conversations for the most part, sitting in my office on the computer and speaking, and it's so lovely to just feel life tweeting all around us, basically, as we're doing it.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
You'll find links to Jeremy's work and things we talked about in the show notes. Thank you to the Center for Process Studies for helping to make this conversation happen in conjunction with their Ecological Civilization Conference. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a supporter on Substack or Patreon. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.